don't have time for this. I got to conserve my mental energy so that when I get to work, I still have something left. I've got to be somewhere. I've got to get to places. I just can't sit down and devote attention to this. This is too off point for me. Those inner voices talking to you in ways that hold you back. Today's episode of Viewpoint with Brett Godfrey is called Inner Voices. We're going to talk about how you've been programmed, who programmed you, and how those programs work in your mind. It's a pretty interesting subject to think about it. It's also a little bit frightening. If you know that you've been programmed, you feel duped, you feel victimized, you feel degraded. But what if, as Ancient Aliens show opener says, what if it were true that you have been programmed by multiple people, including yourself? Let's talk about those inner voices for a minute. What is an inner voice? It is a sound recording that plays on autopilot, almost like the old 8-track tapes. They play for a certain length of time, then they go back to start and replay and replay. Well, those voices do the same thing. They're repetitive. They're sometimes consciously heard. Sometimes they're just sort of an impulsive idea in the back of your mind that says, I don't have time for this. I've got to conserve my mental energy so when I get to work, I have something left. I shouldn't put up with this from my boss. I shouldn't put up with this from my wife. I'm no good. I'm not half the man that my coworkers are. I have a handicap. I'm fundamentally bad at something. These voices tell you things. But now that we are living in a society that we sit by day and watch become ever more polarized, ever more fractured over a whole list of ideas, not just race, not just politics, but we're divided on everything from the vaccine to extraterrestrial presence on Earth to whether or not it's a good idea to have welfare continue to the point where it's causing labor shortages. Think that through. What is allowing those things to become a benign part of our societal landscape? How is it that these things don't make us jump up out of our chair and say, what are you talking about? Because there are voices that go with these experiences, and the voices tell us things. Let's take the extraterrestrials. We see these recent news articles where F-18 pilots and otherwise credible aviation figures, usually it's somebody flying an airline or a jet fighter, but sometimes it's a whole community in a city out in the desert, and they all have the same thing they've seen. And now and then we see a cell phone video pop up that shows us weird lights or little triangular shapes that dart around the sky in ways that no aircraft made by man is capable of. If we have been visited, provably visited, by aliens from outer space, would that not be the single biggest news item in the world? Wouldn't that dominate every channel of every station, of every frequency of the airwaves, as we sit back and say, wow, we really are not alone? Yet it's sort of on page 8. You know, the idea that a credible captain in the Navy saw an object and filmed it with his heads-up display camera or his gun camera, and we look at it and we can't explain it, and we think, well, it's a software glitch. It's a lens flare. It's a reflection. It could be anything. Why are we sitting around bored with this idea? If there really are extraterrestrials capable of constructing vehicles that are able to move that fast and come and go and vanish and dive into the ocean without a splash, that means they've mastered the art of interdimensional transitioning. Interdimensional transitioning is a thing that we all see in various types of science fiction. It could be warp drive, it could be the wormhole effect, it could be the Stargate, it could be all kinds of things. But it's moving in and out of what we think of as the ordinary 3 dimensions plus time in the continuum that we live in. A species capable of doing something that remarkable probably is possessed of weaponry that would cleanse this planet of all life and its atmosphere in a matter of minutes. Are they dangerous? I think not. Because if that really is what we're seeing, I don't think they have hostile intent, because they're being awfully patient. If they had hostile intent, we wouldn't be here at all right now. There might be germs in the soil, but that would be about it. There would be no other life on this planet if what they wanted to do was come here to destroy things. But what is the voice that turns our brains off when we think about those news stories and how huge they should be and they're not? And even if they're not, we say, well, it's because it's a hoax. It's because there's no scientific support. It's just yet one more thing dredged up by the merchants of chaos and the news media to try to get people to look at clickbait while they're doom scrolling on their device. Imagine if I went back in time to myself in 1972 and I used a phrase that involved doom scrolling for clickbait on my device. That'd be, what? What does that mean? Everybody knows what that means today. Our lexicon is changing. What that means is the language in which we speak is changing faster now than ever, because we're constantly coming up with new words based on emerging new social phenomena and emerging new technologies. So our lexicon is changing. Our language is fundamentally altering. Now it's no longer appropriate to say him or her. We have to say them and their if we don't know for sure what the preferences are for the identification of the person. Well, what is this idea? Identification. When I say I identify as, what does that really mean? I identify as a short, fat, bald man who practices law in southern Denver, Colorado. I identify as a man. I identify as a husband and a father. I'm an old-fashioned guy. I identify as these things. Well, as soon as we start to ask ourselves how someone identifies, it almost sounds like we're accepting the fact that they've put on a costume. If I identify as, it means I'm not, but wish I were. If I identify as anything other than just being what I am, we've added this layer of conversion. We've added this layer of transformation. We have said, you're something you're not. By your choice, your preference, we'll respect that. But there's an insidious hidden evil in the way those words and those sound bites and those inner voices have been implanted into our minds. First, we start with the idea that social acceptance requires politically correct speech. That's not new. We've had that since the days of the Spanish Inquisition, where one false slip of the tongue could land you in a bonfire or a torture chamber, or at the end of an executioner's blade. This isn't new. Society puts pressure on its members to conform, and usually that conformance takes its first appearance as monitoring speech, and also not just avoiding certain phrases or certain words, but being sure to use the accepted and approved language. And now we've got that. We have a lot of stuff that comes out of what I want to loosely call the LGBTQ movement, or gay pride, or whatever you want to call it. We've got language that comes out of the debate over the Second Amendment. We've got special words that come out of the Black Lives Matter movement and the Blue Lives Matter movement and the All Lives Matter movement. And I'm not here to negate or minimize anything, but I'm here to tell you there's a phenomena at work, and it's boiling in 20,000 pots at once. And each one of them's a little bit different than the one next to it. So we find ourselves sort of lost. Like, what's going on with the world? How do I get oriented? Where's a map? Which way's north? How do I get a stable datum that I can think with? Well, This podcast is designed to do that, at least help you do that, by asking you to focus on observing with your own eyes, thinking with your own brain, listening with your own ears. The next episode of Viewpoint will be about communication and where it goes wrong. But right now we're talking about inner voices that program us and reprogram us minute by minute, day by day, and we don't even realize it's happening, though if we stop and listen, we will hear those voices. This guy has to be full of crap. That lady doesn't know what she's talking about, etc., etc. We have these voices that come out. Why? Well, with those last two, it's because we're not listening to the person, which is why this segues into communication. But when it comes to being told something over and over, such as we had with the various chants that the Republicans were using to reelect Donald Trump, and the same types of chants that the Democrats were using to elect Joe Biden, this stuff gets repeated and repeated and repeated, don't you know? If I repeat something to you often enough, you'll start to internalize it, and your brain will start to play it back on its own. The human brain is hardwired to accept and absorb patterns, because the inability to do that made it so that when we got into a close call with a mountain lion when we were first emerging from caves, we wouldn't remember that that particular cave has a mountain lion in it. We wouldn't adhere to the pattern of stay away from that cave, stay away from those areas where mountain lions are. We would just keep doing the dangerous thing over and over and not learn. So the brain adapted early in our evolutionary process to allow for hardwired software to go into our minds. And sometimes it's subliminal. Sometimes it's just flash pictures in your mind that flash and flash. And sometimes it's at a subconscious level. Other times you hear the voice. I don't have time for this. I've got to get to work. I've got to conserve my mental energy so I have something left. Where do those voices come from? Well, we write a lot of that ourselves. And the reason we do it is because we were under pressure sometime in the past. We were facing a crisis. We were facing the threat of the indignity of failing to keep a promise because we ran out of time. And so we taught ourselves, I don't have time for anything except the key stuff, but I can't figure out what the key stuff is. David Allen wrote a book about this called Getting Things Done, The Art of Stress-Free Productivity. And it's a beautiful book. I talk about it a lot on the podcast because he helps you sort out your priorities with a system. Of course, his idea is the mind is made for having ideas, not keeping track of them. But these automatically recorded sound bites don't take up much memory space. It's not like keeping track of the 20 things you have to do on your job between now and, say, next Thursday. It's more like just constantly running in the background, like elevator music. You can't sit still. You're not doing something you're supposed to be doing. Why do we believe that? Why are we so anxious all the time over that one recording? You're not doing what you should be doing right now. You know that voice is in your head. You know darn good and well it is. It's even telling you maybe you're wasting time listening to my podcast. You should get on with something else. You should be doing something urgent that you'll wish desperately you had done when you get to a day from now or 2 days or a month from now. You'll wish you hadn't squandered your time in self-enrichment, entertainment, doing something interesting, because there's something there you're supposed to be doing that you're not. And that voice is always running. It's always telling you, no, you should be doing this. Let's say you sit down and you do the first item on your task list and it was put number 1 because it's the most important. The minute you start doing that, you'll start wondering about what else did you forget to put on your task list. You'll start wondering whether you misprioritized something. And this is the key to procrastination. If you don't give yourself permission to turn off all the noise in your head and focus on doing a thing, which might be reading a report, it might be writing a report, it might be making a series of phone calls, it might be organizing a gathering, it could be anything. But if you don't let yourself relax into a task until it is done and done well, you will procrastinate. You will run around never able to focus, and your stress builds and builds and builds until the next thing you know, you're taking pills, you're drinking booze, you don't sleep well, you have insomnia, you start to show mood disorders, somebody diagnoses you as bipolar or attention deficit disorder. This whole concept of attention deficit disorder comes from voices, distractions that are built into our own inner monologue. So how do you solve all this? You have to stop judging and simply listen. Be alert when the voice says A, B, or C. Just notice it. Notice that it happened. And then develop a skill to realize that voice may have been put there by you, or it may have been put there by someone else, but it isn't you. That voice is just a recording that was made at a neurological level and stored in your brain, and it just plays as part of your conscious awareness. But it isn't you. That voice is not you, any more than the voice coming from the next door table at the diner is you. It's just a voice that you're hearing. You have to be able to shut it out. You have to be able to invalidate it. You have to be able to just pretend that, yeah, it's there, but I'm going to ignore it, like the sound of my refrigerator humming in the kitchen. But you can't do any of that stuff if you don't realize that the voice is talking to you, that you are hardwired to listen to it and treat it with respect and obey it, and somehow conform your behavior to what it implies. You've got to separate that voice from you and externalize it and desensitize yourself to it and bring yourself to that stage where you say, you know, it's funny, I've got all these recordings in my mind, but the more I bring myself to where I focus on who I'm with right now, I focus on who I'm talking to at this moment, I focus on the job I'm doing right now. If it's digging a hole, great. If it's writing a masterful legal brief, great. But whatever it is, just do it. And the voice will fade away on its own. But when those inner voices lead you to destructive behavior, maybe suggesting a series of ideas that you start to latch onto, and the next thing you know, you're thinking about shooting up a grocery store or really letting your boss have it, telling him, that's that. You don't get to talk to me that way, and wrecking your whole employment status. When you're guided by those voices to do something destructive, that's where you have to stop and rewrite your own script. Because you have that power. I'm Brett Godfrey. Thanks for listening.